Matchmaking in MMA is certainly a tough job. You can never really be too sure just how things will play out in the lead-up to a fight. But whether it was due to a late-notice replacement, money, or just bad decision-making, these fights were pretty suspect from the get-go. Now, without further ado, and ranked in no particular order, here are 10 MMA fights that never should have happened. Number 10. Sean O'Malley vs. Chris Moutinho. To kick things off, we have one of the most statistically one-sided fights you'll ever see reach a third round. Chris Moutinho was never actually scheduled to fight Sean O'Malley initially, but when Luis Smolka pulled out for their bout due to injury, Chris Moutinho was given the opportunity of a lifetime, making his UFC debut to face off against the rising star, despite going 2-2 in his last 4 fights and having no prior UFC experience. Unfortunately, he really had nothing for O'Malley, except for his ability to absorb damage. Over the 14.5 minutes the fight lasted before its stoppage, O'Malley landed 230 of his 318 attempted strikes, with a massive 72% accuracy. And Chris Moutinho, to his credit, ate them all, losing by a standing TKO when it was clear that nobody needed to see the fight go any longer. Number 9. CM Punk vs. Mickey Gall. Chance or bad luck often brings lopsided fights together, but this next one was created by the UFC as a means of making some significant money. CM Punk deserves a lot of credit for trying his hand at MMA, but the path he decided to take in achieving his goals was one that was lined with the type of privilege an 0-0 fighter would never have. He didn't begin on the regional scene and fight his way up. He instead went straight to the UFC and got thoroughly dominated by Mickey Gall, a fighter who was 4-0 at the time and had far more experience. Unfortunately, it wasn't even remotely competitive, with Phil Brooks being submitted in the opening minutes. And though CM Punk got another shot in the promotion, most fans had already written him off at this point. In hindsight, it was an obvious mismatch on the UFC's part. Number 8. Randy Couture vs. James Toney. Typically, when an MMA fighter faces off against a boxer, the bout will usually favor the fighter with the home court advantage. And this next entry is pretty much the gold standard on how badly MMA can go for an amateur. That amateur was boxing sensation James Toney, a legendary pugilist who decided to step out of the ring and try his hand at the multidisciplined world of the UFC. The problem? Randy Couture, a 6-time UFC champion, was his opponent. And to say that he ran through him would be putting it lightly. Couture immediately took the fight to the ground, cinching in an arm triangle choke just moments later. Randy Couture and Dana White have had their differences over the years, but this fight felt like the UFC president sent in one of his most decorated fighters to run through one of the sport's biggest naysayers. Number 7. Daniel Cormier vs. Patrick Cummins. Picture the scene. Your pro MMA career is starting to take off, and in your first 4 fights, you've managed to score all finishes, with an equal pair of knockouts and submissions. All of a sudden, the UFC and Dana White call your manager with the opportunity you've been dreaming of, a UFC contract. The problem? Well, it turns out that you're stepping in on short notice, replacing the great Rashad Evans to take on the undefeated former Olympian and Strikeforce heavyweight Grand Prix winner Daniel Cormier. Safe to say, this was not an ideal debut for Patrick Cummins, and when the cage doors closed, it certainly showed. In the end, DC took just 80 seconds to finish Patrick Cummins by way of TKO. To his credit, Cummins went on to win his next 3 in the UFC, but there's no denying that this was a bad matchmaking move by the promoters. Number 6. Robbie Lawler vs. Nick Diaz 2. To his credit, Nick Diaz did far better than anyone could have expected after a 6-year layoff from mixed martial arts. But all throughout fight week, Nick himself even seemed quite unsure about what he was doing back in the UFC.
I don't know why I'm doing this. This should not happen. Whoever set this up is an idiot.
There seemed to be a real conflict within him every time he had a microphone in front of his face, and his physique frankly made it look like he had just rolled off the couch. Surprisingly, he did a lot better in the fight than most people expected, throwing the type of volume that was reminiscent of his prime years. But when Lawler finally caught him clean on the chin and Nick went down, I think we were all a little relieved when he decided against continuing. Nick Diaz will always be regarded as a legend of the sport, but given his behavior in the lead up to the fight, it's pretty clear that he wasn't ready to return. Number 5. Chuck Liddell vs. Tito Ortiz 3. All of these fights are questionable, and others are downright bad, but the third and final matchup between Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz was in another league of its own. Championed by Oscar de la Hoya and the strangely eager Tito Ortiz, the bout was set up to try and recapture the magic of a fight that was relevant 15 years ago. Ortiz is still a relatively active fighter these days, but Chuck Liddell had been retired from the sport for 8 years when he made his return, and was nearing his 49th birthday. Tito Tito, being the fresher fighter, was able to swarm Liddell with punches, finishing him in the opening round. What made this fight so awful was just how out of place the Iceman looked, and how he was unable to even get his footwork right. To make matters worse, as soon as Tito Ortiz won, he celebrated as if he had just captured UFC gold, a display that left a pretty sour taste in our mouths. Number 4. Jon Jones vs. Chael Sonnen. If you needed any more proof of the fact that Chael Sonnen can talk his way into anything, look no further than his 205-pound title fight against Jon Jones, which took place at UFC 159 back in 2013. The justification for giving the bad guy this fight, especially coming off of a loss to Anderson Silva at middleweight, was the UFC's decision to build a season of The Ultimate Fighter around these two rivals. As you would expect, Jon Jones easily dealt with Sonnen on fight night, choosing to specifically beat him using his clinch work and wrestling, almost as if to prove a point about his overall superiority. What's crazy about this fight, though, is that if Chael had lasted another 27 seconds and hadn't been TKO'd in the first round, he would have won by doctor stoppage due to a gruesome toe injury from Jon Jones, which he didn't even notice himself until his post-fight interview. Number 3. Conor McGregor vs. Donald Cerrone. Sure, we know that Conor McGregor needed a comeback opponent who had a big enough name to bring in some interest, but given the fact that Donald Cerrone had just lost to both Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje, and had a habit of struggling under the bright lights, it was pretty clear that the UFC were feeding him to the Irishman for a quick knockout. And sure enough, it took McGregor just 40 seconds to get Cerrone out of there, catching the veteran with his own trademark head kick before ending his night with a swarm of punches. Unfortunately, things wouldn't get any easier for Cerrone from there, and he would never record another UFC win before his retirement in 2022. Number 2. Kamaru Usman vs. Jorge Masvidal 2. It's obvious that Jorge Masvidal is a big name, and we know that doing Dana White a favor is always going to get you preferential treatment. But when Jorge was given a second consecutive shot at Kamaru Usman's welterweight title, more than a few of us were left scratching our heads. Sure, Masvidal had done Dana White a solid by stepping up on short notice to fight Usman the first time around, but the first meeting didn't show us anything that would make us believe a rematch was needed. Of course, the UFC went ahead with it anyway, and unfortunately, it backfired. Usman showed improved striking this time, and in the second round, when he found his opening, he caught Masvidal with a major KO of the year contender, effectively ending his hype right then and there. A huge statement victory for the former welterweight champion. Number 1. Mark Hunt vs. Brock Lesnar. And finally, we come to one of the most questionable pieces of matchmaking the UFC has ever done. UFC 200 was set to be a major event for the promotion, and with their biggest star Conor McGregor set to headline a rematch against Nate Diaz, Dana knew he had a winner on his hands. But then Conor famously retired from the sport following disagreements with the company, and all of a sudden, UFC 200 was in some hot water. Jon Jones's rematch with Daniel Cormier was pointed to as a potential replacement, and that too would eventually fall out. But it was pretty clear that something more was needed. So the UFC turned to their former heavyweight champion, the WWE superstar Brock Lesnar. And after getting both the okay from Vince McMahon and some pretty shady test exemptions from USADA, Brock was cleared to fight. Mark Hunt was his opponent, and despite his time away, Lesnar put in a strong performance to seal the victory on the scorecards. However, as it turned out, Lesnar wasn't actually clean, testing positive for an undisclosed banned substance. Now, we're not saying that the UFC knew he was on something and worked out a way to get an exemption from USADA, even though they knew he would fail later, just so they could save their event, but it wouldn't be that far-fetched to imagine such a scenario. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.